My lord, fire fell from the sky. Your sheep and your servants are all dead.
Job's legs weakened. But soon, a third man came running toward him.
The Chaldeans took the camels and killed everyone. I alone have escaped.
My lord, your sons and daughters were feasting at their oldest brother's house.
Job fell to his knees, tore his robe, and shaved his head. Instead of cursing, he worshipped.
Blessed be the name of the Lord.
There was a land called Uz on the borders of the east, where the desert met the mountains and caravans crossed ancient paths. It was a region of hardened men, forged by the merciless sun and freezing nights. There, among tents and flocks that stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a man whose name echoed through all the neighboring nations. Job, the richest man in the East, the most upright, the most God-fearing. His estate was a city in itself. 7,000 sheep grazed on his hills, covering the fields like white clouds touching the earth. 3,000 camels rested in his stables, ready to cross deserts and carry fortunes. 500 yoke of oxen plowed his fertile lands, and 500 donkeys transported the abundant harvests. Countless servants worked under his command, and each one of them was treated with dignity. Job was not merely rich, he was righteous, and that combination was as rare as water in the desert. His home was the center of a family that seemed blessed by the heavens. 10 children, 7 strong sons and 3 daughters of singular beauty. They loved each other. They celebrated together. Each brother, on his appointed day, opened the doors of his house to receive the others, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air until dawn. Job watched all of this with a heart overflowing with gratitude. But even in joy, he did not forget God. Every morning, before the sun painted the horizon orange, Job would rise. He would walk to the altar of stones that he himself had built, and there, on his knees upon the earth still wet with dew, he offered burnt offerings for each of his children. Perhaps they have sinned in their hearts, he thought. Perhaps they have cursed God without realizing it. And so, day after day, Job covered his family with prayers and sacrifices. It was his sacred routine, his holy obsession. But what Job did not know was that his name was being spoken in a place far beyond the stars. There came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Angels of light, celestial beings, creatures that existed before time gathered before the eternal throne. And among them, like a shadow infiltrating where it should not be, came also Satan, the adversary, the accuser. His eyes scanned the celestial assembly with poorly disguised contempt. God saw him. God always saw him. And the voice of the Almighty cut through the silence like thunder. Where have you come from? It was not a question from one who does not know. It was a summons. Satan responded with the arrogance that was peculiar to him. From roaming through the earth and walking back and forth in it, I went from one side to the other, observing, analyzing, searching. The Lord was not intimidated. On the contrary, his eyes shone with something that seemed like paternal pride. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless, upright. He fears God. He shuns evil. Satan tilted his head. A crooked smile appeared on his lips. Does Job fear God for nothing? The words dripped like venom. The accuser took a step forward, his voice laden with insinuation. Have you not put a hedge around him, around his household, and around everything he has? Everything he touches prospers, his flocks multiply, his lands produce, his children are healthy. Of course he worships you. Satan made a calculated pause. But stretch out your hand, strike everything. He has, and we shall see. He will curse you to your face. The silence that followed weighed like lead upon the celestial assembly. No angel dared breathe. And then God spoke. Very well. Everything he has is in your hands. Only do not lay a hand on him. The authorization was given. Satan bowed in a mocking reverence and vanished like smoke carried by the wind. War had been declared, and Job had no idea. It was a day like any other in the land of Uz. The sun shone brightly, the fields were green, the flocks grazed peacefully. Job had just finished his morning prayers and was sitting in the shade of an ancient fig tree when he saw a figure appear on the horizon. A man running, stumbling, falling, and getting up. As he approached, Job could see the terror stamped on his face. The man was one of his servants. His clothes were torn. There was blood on his hands. He fell at Job's feet, breathless, barely able to form words. Master! The oxen were plowing, the donkeys were grazing nearby. The Sabaeans. They came out of nowhere, they attacked, they took the animals, they killed. The servants with the sword. I was the only one who escaped to tell you. Job felt as if a spear had pierced his chest. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, dozens of faithful servants, dead in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any sound could come out, another man appeared running down the same path. His face was black with soot. His eyebrows had been burned off. Master, fire. Fire fell from the sky. The sheep, all 7,000, the shepherds, consumed. The flames came from above. There was no way to escape. I was the only one who survived. Fire from the sky. The words echoed in Job's mind like a funeral bell. His legs began to tremble. The world around him seemed to lose its colors. And then a third messenger appeared. This one came from the north. There were wounds on his arms, blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Master, the Chaldeans. They formed 3 bands. They surrounded the camels, all 3,000. They took everything. They killed the servants. I barely escaped. I came running. Only I was left to tell. You. Job staggered backward. His back hit the trunk of the fig tree. In a matter of minutes, his entire fortune had been swept away. Years of work, generations of accumulation, everything. But nothing could have prepared him for what would come next. A fourth messenger appeared on the road. This one was not running. He walked slowly, like someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His clothes were covered with dust and debris. When he arrived before Job, he could not look into his eyes. His voice came out as a broken whisper. Master, your sons, your daughters, they were feasting at the firstborn's house, eating, drinking, celebrating. And then a wind came, a terrible wind, from the desert. It struck the 4 corners of the house. The structure could not withstand it. It collapsed. It fell on all of them. Your 10 children, all dead. There were no survivors. I was the only one who escaped to tell you. Silence. The world stopped spinning. The wind stopped blowing. The birds stopped singing. Job stood motionless for an instant that seemed to last an eternity. His eyes were fixed on some point beyond the horizon, as if his soul had left his body. And then something broke inside him. A guttural sound rose from his depths. It was not a scream. It was something deeper, more primal, the lament of a father who has just lost everything he loved. Job tore the robe he was wearing. The fabric ripped with a sound that echoed through the valley. He fell to his knees on the ground, the dust rising around him like a cloud of desolation. With his own hands, he shaved his head, pulling out his hair in clumps, leaving his scalp exposed and bleeding. And then he did something no one expected. He fell prostrate with his face to the ground and worshipped. Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked I will return. The Lord gave. The Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The words came from his mouth like a declaration of war against despair. In all this, Job did not sin. He did not blame God for anything. But the trial was only beginning. There came another day when the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and again among them came Satan. His eyes were darker now, his posture more tense. He had failed. Job had not cursed God. The Lord received him with the same words as before. "Where have you come from?" Satan responded through clenched teeth. "From roaming through the earth, from walking back and forth in it." God continued, "Have you considered my servant Job? He still maintains his integrity. You incited me against him to ruin him without cause, and yet he remains faithful." Satan raised his chin, skin for skin. "A man will give everything he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand. Strike his bones and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." There was desperation in the accuser's voice. This was his last card. God nodded slowly. "He is in your hands, but preserve his life." Satan departed like lightning. Job was sitting among the ashes of what had been his life when he felt the first sting. It started in his left foot, an itch that quickly turned into burning. He looked down and saw a wound forming, as if the skin were being burned from the inside out. And then another and another within hours. His entire body was covered with malignant sores, from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. Festering wounds that exuded a nauseating odor, blisters that burst and turned into scabs, scabs that cracked and bled. The pain was unbearable. Every movement was agony, every breath torment. Job dragged himself out of his house. He did not want anyone to see him like this. He found a heap of ashes on the outskirts of the city, where garbage was burned and outcasts hid. There, among the remains and filth, Job sat down. He found a broken piece of pottery and began to scrape his wounds, trying to relieve the unbearable itching that consumed him. The richest man in the East was now indistinguishable from beggars and lepers. That was when she appeared, his wife, the woman who had been by his side for decades, the mother of his 10 dead children. She stopped at a safe distance, her face contorted in a mixture of horror and rage. She looked at her husband, that devastated figure covered in wounds and ashes, and something inside her broke. "You still maintain your integrity." The words came out loaded with bitterness. "Curse God and die." It was advice born of desperation. She could no longer bear to see the suffering. She could no longer bear her own pain. She wanted it all to end, any way possible. Job raised his eyes to her. There were tears mixed with pus streaming down his disfigured face, but his voice came out firm. "You speak as a foolish woman speaks. Shall we accept good from God and not accept adversity?" She did not respond. She turned her back and left. Job was alone again. In all this, he did not sin with his lips. And then the friends came. News of Job's disaster spread throughout the region like fire in dry straw. 3 men who had known him for a long time decided to visit him. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. They were wise men, respected in their communities, known for their piety and knowledge of traditions. They agreed to go together to mourn with Job and comfort him. They departed from their lands and traveled for days until they reached the region of Uz. When they caught sight of Job from afar, they did not recognize him. That skeletal figure, covered in wounds, could not be the imposing man they knew, but it was. And when the realization struck them, they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes. They threw dust on their heads toward the sky. And then they did something extraordinary. They sat down beside Job on the ground, in silence, for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word. Job's pain was too great for words. His appearance was too terrible for comments. The 3 friends were simply there, present, sharing the mourning through silence. But the days of peace would not last long. On the 8th day, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, 'A man has been conceived.' May that day turn to darkness. May God not look upon it from above. May no light shine upon it. The words poured out like blood from an open wound. Job poured out all his anguish, all his questioning, all his incomprehensible pain. Why did I not perish at birth? Why did I not expire when I came out of the womb? Why is light given to the miserable and life to the bitter of soul? He did not curse God, but he questioned, he challenged, he cried out to the empty sky, demanding answers that did not come. If this story is touching your heart, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Here, each narrative is a journey through the sacred pages, and what comes next in Job's story will reveal who his friends really were and what happens when God finally breaks his silence. Eliphaz was the first to respond. As the oldest and most respected of the three, he felt obligated to speak. His voice was calm, almost gentle at first. Job, if someone tries to say a word to you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? You have instructed many. You have strengthened weak hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. But now that trouble comes to you, you are discouraged. Now that it strikes you, you are dismayed. Eliphaz made a dramatic pause. Consider now, who that was innocent ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. The accusation was launched. For Eliphaz, the logic was simple. God is just. Suffering is punishment. If Job was suffering, it was because he had sinned. Retribution theology in its cruelest form. Job was covered in wounds, mourning his 10 dead children, and his friend was telling him that he had deserved all of this. Bildad was even more direct, his words cut like blades. How long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? And then came the cruelest blow of all. If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. Bildad was saying that Job's children had died because of their own sins, that they had deserved the house collapsing on their heads. For a grieving father, there were no more devastating words. Zophar completed the trio of accusations. He was the youngest and the most aggressive. Should this multitude of words go unanswered? Should this talker be vindicated? You say your doctrine is pure, that you are clean in God's eyes. But oh, if God would speak, if he would open his lips against you, he would show you the secrets of wisdom, and know that God exacts from you less than your guilt deserves. Zophar was saying that Job was suffering less than he should, that his sins were so great that even his current suffering was mercy. And so began the cycles of debates. For chapters and chapters, the friends accused and Job defended himself. Eliphaz spoke of night visions and ancestral traditions. Bildad cited ancient proverbs and the wisdom of the fathers. Zophar appealed to the cold logic of retributive justice. And Job, in response, cried out his innocence to the heavens. I know that I am righteous. This I know. There is no transgression or sin in me. Why then does God treat me as an enemy? The debates became more heated, the accusations more direct. At one point, Eliphaz abandoned all pretense of gentleness. Is not your wickedness great? Are not your iniquities endless? You took pledges from your brothers for nothing. You stripped the naked of their clothing. You gave no water to the weary. You withheld bread from the hungry. You sent widows away empty-handed. The arms of orphans were broken. Specific accusations, detailed crimes, none of them true. But for the friends, it was the only possible explanation for so much suffering. Job felt increasingly isolated. His possessions had been taken. His children were dead. His health destroyed. His wife had abandoned him emotionally. And now his best friends were telling him that everything was his fault. The loneliness was crushing, the pain unbearable, and God's silence deafening. But in the midst of the darkness, something shone. It was during one of his laments that Job spoke words that would cross millennia, words that would be quoted at funerals and moments of despair until the end of time. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him, my own eyes will behold him, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. It was a declaration of faith in the midst of the abyss. Job did not understand why he was suffering. He had no answers for the accusations. He saw no way out of his situation. But he knew one thing: God was real, and one day, somehow, Job would see him face to face. The debates continued. Zophar did not respond again. Perhaps he had run out of arguments. Perhaps he had grown tired. Bildad offered one last weak speech about God's greatness and man's insignificance, and Job made his final defense. An extensive monologue where he reviewed his entire life, his good works, his integrity. That was when a new character entered the scene. Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite. He was younger than the others and had remained silent out of respect for his elders. But his patience had reached its end. His anger burned against Job because he justified himself rather than God. And his anger also burned against the three friends because they had found no answer yet, had condemned Job. Elihu spoke at length. His approach was different. He did not accuse Job of specific sins. Instead, he argued that God uses suffering to teach, to correct, to prevent future sins. God speaks once and twice, but man does not perceive it. In dreams, in visions of the night, when deep sleep falls upon men, to turn man from his purpose and hide pride from him, to preserve his soul from the pit and his life from the sword. Elihu pointed to the heavens. Look up at the heavens and see. Gaze at the clouds which are higher than you. If you sin, what do you accomplish against him? If your transgressions are many, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? His argument was that God was too great to be affected by human behavior, yet still cared enough to intervene. Elihu's speeches set the stage. He had spoken about storms and clouds, about thunder and lightning, about God's power manifested in nature. And then, as if responding to his words, the wind began to blow. And then it happened. On the horizon, a dark cloud began to form. It was not an ordinary cloud. It was dense, spinning upon itself, growing with every second. The wind increased in intensity. The dust began to swirl. The men's robes flapped violently. Elihu stopped speaking mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward the phenomenon that was approaching. It was a whirlwind, but not just any whirlwind. This one had something different, a presence, a gravity that made the air seem heavier, time seem slower. The whirlwind approached, the group of men, and stopped right before Job. And then, from the midst of that vortex of wind and power, a voice thundered. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? It was the voice of God. Job felt every cell of his body tremble. The three friends fell with their faces to the ground. Elihu retreated in terror, but Job remained upright, his eyes fixed on the center of the whirlwind, tears streaming down the wounds on his face. God was speaking. Finally, after all the silence, after all the unanswered questions, God was there. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. The voice of the Almighty continued, and what followed was not an explanation. It was not a justification. It was an avalanche of questions. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you have understanding. Who marked off its dimensions if you know? Or who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The questions continued, relentless. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? Have you ever given orders to the morning since your days began, or shown the dawn its place? Have you entered the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you, or have you seen the gates of the shadow of death? God spoke of the snow and the hail, of the lightning and the constellations, of the lion and the raven, of the mountain goat and the doe, of the wild donkey and the wild ox, of the ostrich and the war horse, of the hawk and the eagle. The entire creation was paraded before Job as a testimony to the unfathomable wisdom and power of God. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who argues with God answer him. Job opened his mouth. His voice came out like a thread. Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, and I will not answer. Indeed, twice, but I will proceed no further. But God had not finished. The whirlwind intensified. The voice thundered louder. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall make it known to me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? Can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and splendor. Clothe yourself with glory and honor. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and humble him. God then described two creatures of incomprehensible power, the behemoth, a colossal beast that ate grass like an ox, but whose strength was in its loins and whose power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail was like a cedar, the bones of its thighs like tubes of bronze, its limbs like bars of iron, and the Leviathan, a sea monster that no man dared provoke. Its scales were proud shields, closely sealed together. Its sneezing threw forth light. Its eyes were like the rays of dawn. Torches came from its mouth. Sparks of fire leaped out. Its heart was hard as stone, hard as a lower millstone. The message was clear. If Job could not master these creatures, how could he question their creator? And then the final revelation. Job fell prostrate with his face to the ground. His words came out mixed with sobs. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job did not receive explanations. He did not learn of the heavenly wager. He did not understand why his children died, or why his wounds would not heal. But he received something infinitely greater. He received God. And in the presence of the eternal, the questions lost their urgency. The whirlwind began to dissipate. The wind calmed. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was a silence of peace, of resolution, of something that had been completed. God then turned to Eliphaz. My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you. I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. The 3 friends obeyed, trembling. They brought the animals. They prepared the altar. And there, before the man they had falsely accused for so many chapters, they bowed their heads, and Job prayed for them. The man who had lost everything prayed for the men who had worsened his pain. The grace was scandalous, the mercy inexplicable, and the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. The change was immediate and supernatural. Job's wounds began to heal. The skin that had been covered with ulcers regenerated. Strength returned to his limbs. Color returned to his face. And then the blessings began to pour in. Relatives who had disappeared during his suffering reappeared. Friends who had distanced themselves came back to see him. Each of them brought gifts, Money, gold rings, offerings of condolence and celebration mixed together. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first. Where before there had been 7,000 sheep, now there were 14,000. Where there had been 3,000 camels, now there were 6,000. The 500 yoke of oxen became 1,000. The 500 donkeys doubled to 1,000. Job's fortune was not merely restored, it was multiplied. And the children, God gave Job 7 more sons and 3 daughters. He named the first daughter Jemimah, which means dove. The second Kezia, which means cassia, a precious spice. The third Keren-Happuch, which means container of antimony. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers, a rare honor in those times. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and his children's children to the 4th generation, and he died old and full of days. Job's story does not end with answers. It ends with presence, it ends with restoration, it ends with a man who, after crossing the darkest valley, could say the most transformative words ever spoken. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. This is the difference between religion and relationship, between theology and experience, between knowing about God and knowing God. Job spent his entire previous life being righteous, offering sacrifices, following rules, fearing God. But it was a second-hand faith, an inherited faith, a faith built on what others had told him. The storm changed everything. The pain that should have destroyed him became the portal to something he would never have reached. In prosperity, a direct vision of the eternal, a first-hand experience with the creator of the universe. Job did not come out of suffering with explanations. He came out with something infinitely more valuable. He came out with intimacy. Perhaps you are in your own heap of ashes right now. Perhaps the wounds are not visible, but the pain is unbearable. Perhaps friends who should be comforting are accusing. Perhaps the sky seems made of bronze. Perhaps your prayers seem to hit the ceiling and return. Job's story is not a promise that everything will be explained. It is a promise that God will show up, one way or another, in His time, in His way. And when He shows up, the questions change. It is no longer, why is this happening to me? It is, who is this God so great that He controls the Leviathan and counts the stars by name? It is no longer, when will this end? It is, how can I know Him more? The perspective changes, the heart changes, everything changes. Perhaps your storm is not punishment. Perhaps it is invitation. Invitation to leave second-hand religion and enter first-hand experience. Invitation to stop merely hearing about God and finally see Him with your own eyes. The path is painful, the process is brutal, but the destination is worth every tear. Job lost everything in a single day, and in the end, he gained what no money can buy. He gained God. Not as a concept, not as tradition, as a living, burning reality before his eyes. Are you ready to stop merely hearing and finally see? If this story touched your heart, write in the comments, I want to see God with my own eyes.